My clock says 12 o'clock noon here on the East Coast in North Carolina. So let's begin. Welcome everyone to our Spirituality and Health Research Seminar. And today I am thrilled to be able to introduce Dr. Mark Heim. Dr. Heim is going to speak on forgiveness as a vital sign, an evolutionary and theological perspective. So Dr. Heim is from Yale Divinity School. He is a Samuel Abbott Professor of Christian Theology at Andover Newton Seminary at Yale Divinity School. His books include Salvations, Truth and Difference in Religions, Saved from Sacrifice, A Theology of the Cross, Crucified Wisdom, Christ and the Bodhisattva in Theological Reflection, and Monotheism and Forgiveness. I believe that monotheism and forgiveness will be part of his talk today. He was recently primary investigator on a grant from the American Academy for the Advancement of Science devoted to integrating science into the theology curriculum. With a colleague from Yale Medical School, Dr. Benjamin Doolittle, whom some of you may know, he teaches interdisciplinary course on theology and medicine. So Mark works with Ben on that course there at Yale on theology and medicine. An ordained American Baptist minister, Dr. Heim's teaching and research interests include comparative theology, theologies of religious pluralism, science and theology, Christology and atonement, and ecumenical ecclesiastology. Now, Dr. Heim has agreed to present today despite having COVID-19. So, you know, he is a real trooper, and we sure appreciate him giving it a try here. So if there's some coughing and sneezing, that's okay. We can deal with that. So Mark, go ahead and share your screen and take it over.
Okay, I hope you can see the
Yes.
PowerPoint.
Yes.
Okay, great. It's a pleasure to be with you. As Harold said, I finally won the lottery and got COVID. So please do excuse any coughing or sneezing that happens here. But I didn't want to miss the opportunity to be with you. This epigram from Alexander Solzhenitsyn is a kind of heading for my talk, but in two different ways. His comment says, forgiving transcends the relentless law of nature. I want to suggest today that a certain aspect of forgiveness is part of the law of nature in a pretty wide sense in the biological world, but human beings have in developing what we have as human nature, humans did take forgiveness to a new level that's not found in the biological world more generally. So that's the overall picture of my talk. I'm drawing today on material I've used elsewhere in my book that Harold mentioned, Monotheism and Forgiveness, Cambridge University Press, 2022, and a presentation I gave at the Harvard Forgiveness Conference back in April last year, a program that was run by Professor Tyler Vanderweel at Harvard School of Public Health. And forgiveness has become quite a growing field of research in the field of psychology. And Professor Vanderweel's own writing has suggested that forgiveness is actually a public health issue, relevant to be studied in a school of public health, like Harvard School of Public Health. And in that connection, I'll go quickly through some of these slides, and the thought that it's recorded, so if you miss something you want to pick up later, you can come back and see that. The conference unveiled the largest cross-cultural study of forgiveness ever conducted a randomized control trial with almost 5,000 participants in, I think, 6 or 7 different countries. And it involved the use of a forgiveness workbook just over a 2-week period. And it showed a half a standard deviation improvement on things like trait forgiveness, a quarter standard deviation improvement in anxiety and depression. So I just mentioned this to say that forgiveness itself is quite a hot topic for research, but primarily focused at the individual level, even though Professor Vanderweel is pushing it into the public health dimension, is making it more than individual, for sure. But in my talk today, I want to back up this issue and this interest in forgiveness and public health with a much broader perspective, to suggest that forgiveness is a key aspect of how religion has made us human historically and continues to shape human life in continuing transformation. And I'm doing this more from the collective perspective than from the individual perspective. So the introduction here is almost finished. I'm going to then talk about forgiveness in the wider sort of story of human development, and particularly in regard to this feature of human nature that sociologists and biologists would call eusociality. And then I'm going to talk about forgiveness as a peculiar form of altruism, which is centrally key to the development of cooperation in the peculiar extreme of cooperation that characterizes human beings. And then finally, I want to focus more theologically on what we might call the excess of universal forgiveness. That is to say, the religious traditions that tend to exhort us, to teach us that we should practice forgiveness to an extent beyond what seems strategic or reasonable or wise from a maybe rational, self-interested perspective. So I mentioned that there is a lot of interest in forgiveness at the individual level, usually in terms of the benefits that might hold for the person doing the forgiving, or for the benefits of the person being forgiven, but less interest in relation to communities or groups. And my talk is focusing on that aspect, on forgiveness relative to the formation of communities and the constitution even of the community of the human itself. Now, some practice of non-retaliation, as I'm going to explain, some practice of non-retaliation features in normal biological life as a part of the economy of nature, contrary to what Solzhenitsyn might have been suggesting. But part of what made us human was a specifically religious extension of that feature. And this excess of forgiveness, what we might call a kind of economy of grace, became part of the peculiar economy of emergent human nature. So I think monotheism, not only monotheism, maybe all axial age religions, but monotheism in particular, points us in this direction, because monotheism gives forgiveness a universal formulation. It treats it as a fundamental structural concern. Everyone's offense against the neighbor is also an offense against God, and every reconciliation effected between opposing parties is also in some way relevant to God. So every situation is essentially at least a three-party problem. So we're used to assessing forgiveness mainly by its effects within the individuals most directly involved. But the role of forgiveness, I think, can be measured almost as a function of an entire system, as a condition for certain kinds of community. And because in the theological understanding of forgiveness, we often focus a lot on the relationships that are saved by virtue of forgiveness, not just the psychological health benefits to the individuals, but upon the significance of the connections. And I think the wider community has a big investment in these kinds of connections. So in the wider evolutionary perspective, we know that the transition from life in small kin and clan-based bodies to larger communities is crucial in human history. It's critical to shaping the nature of our humanity. And scholars interestingly, largely agree that religion was a prominent feature of this transition. And many theories stress the rising of belief in high gods, so called, that is to say, monotheistic like divinities that are referenced for moral authority and enforcement. They're deities who can see all and judge all, even when the community has become too large for individuals to keep track of all the behavior of each individual. Now, described historically as a class, deities are not universally either morally good or all powerful and all seeing, but monotheistic like divinities are definitely those two things. And as such, God is particularly well suited to the task of overseeing a group whose interactions have grown too complex to be tracked by any single brain alone. Now, somewhere in our cultural development, humanity crossed a crucial boundary and became what biologists call eusocial. The biological category refers to a very small number of species in the entire biological world. The best known are the so-called eusocial insects, certain kinds of wasps and bees and ants. These live in large intergenerational, highly cooperative colonies, practicing an extensive division of labor and very high levels of altruism, by which colonies become a kind of superorganism. Now, what's interesting is that eusociality has arisen very, very rarely in the biological story, but been enormously successful whenever it was achieved. So, for instance, 2% of the insect species in the world are eusocial, but the eusocial insects account for more than 80% of the biomass of all insects on Earth. And I think it's fair to say that humans are the most successful mammals, and that they are eusocial is not an incidental fact about that. So humanity's path to becoming eusocial had to be very different from the path that was taken by these other organisms. It had to happen via culture rather than instinct. But a fundamental similarity is that both paths dramatically loosened the centrality of close kinship for community, and both grew by virtue of between group competition. Axial age religions generally, and monotheism particularly, seems to have been key to this phase transition in human development. And forgiveness, I'm suggesting, was integral to that role that religion played. So to explain that, I need to say a little bit about forgiveness, a kind of reconceiving forgiveness as a special kind of altruism. A social perspective on forgiveness emerges from debates over altruism within the study of human evolutionary development. We need to reconceive forgiveness as a particular kind of altruism. I mean, in evolutionary terms, altruism means one organism gives up a fitness benefit, something that would help it or reproduce, or its genes to be reproduced, something material or positional, in favor of another organism that receives that benefit instead. So usually that would be something material, loss of food, loss of a mating opportunity, and so on. We can conceive of forgiveness as a modality of that sort of altruism. It's where what is given up is not something positive, but something defensive. What's given up is retaliation or self-protection. In fitness terms, the effect of making a gratuitous gift and gratuitously accepting an insult works out to more or less be the same thing. If I donate my meal or I accept the theft of my meal, the net effect is still I'm down one meal to someone else. Now, it's hard initially to see how such altruism can be a successful hereditary trait. Those who practice it would be less likely to have descendants. That would be the kind of simple way of looking at it. But nevertheless, altruistic behavior is widespread in the biological world. And evolutionary theory has developed a whole suite of explanations for why that is true. And to situate those explanations in the wider theological perspective, I think it's helpful to see them as a kind of spectrum, which I've laid out here. At one end, apparent altruistic behavior is explained in terms of kin selection. That is, you give up a benefit to yourself in favor of the benefit going to very close relatives whose well-being will advance your genetic self-interest at least equally well. Parents who sacrifice for their children, or judiciously for siblings or a certain number of nieces and nephews, and so on, enhance their success in leaving genetic descendants. As we move along the spectrum, we could account for additional kinds of selfless behavior, apparently selfless behavior, as being strictly reciprocal altruism. That is to say, within a setting where you can keep track of your interactions with others around you, you can trade gifts to people who will reliably trade gifts back to you. That altruism is kind of a bank account altruism, we might say. It's really loans. You're giving something for the moment to some other organism in the expectation that they'll give some back to you at a later time. And obviously, this only works if you know, others make good on that expectation. So for this to work, the precondition is either a close kinship relation for kin selection or a close kind of operating relationship for reciprocal altruism, an identity, a knowledge of who it was who did what to you in the past, so you can keep track of the bookkeeping. Now, all evolutionary biologists recognize the reality of these dynamics, but they're not sufficient to account for all forms of altruism. If we keep moving along the spectrum to elements with a larger component, and so more relevant to human beings also, we come to another kind, which is called indirect altruism. This kind of altruism extends to those in groups too large for the memory process to maintain the knowledge that you need to practice reciprocal altruism. Now, you might practice altruism toward those that you have never interacted with before, in the expectation that in the future you'll get altruism or altruistic benefits from someone that you're interacting with for the first time. So now the emphasis is upon belonging to a certain kind of network, a certain kind of identity, group identity. So people who have the marker of the identity, or organisms that have the identity marker, you expect to get benefits from them, and you're willing to give benefits to them, even though we're not talking about the same individuals that you're going to be encountering. So if for reciprocal altruism in small groups, you have to remember the individual identity and the behaviors of each actor that you encounter. In this framework, what you need is not a face, you need an identity, a reputation, a group marker, a belongingness sign that you are part of this network from which you can expect this kind of interaction. It's about trust in the community more than it is about trust in the individual. Now, so as we move along this spectrum of different explanations, we begin to reach areas where it becomes more controversial. And in particular, the point at which indirect altruism, I've just been describing, shades over into what is called group selection or multi-level selection. There's some prominent figures in evolutionary biology, particularly E.O. Wilson and Martin Nowak, who have become ardent advocates for this view, which used to be kind of a heresy in the biological evolutionary world. They view groups as units of selection, and the development of altruistic members within a group as a structural variation that makes the group successful. So that means individuals who sacrifice their fitness for the sake of the group benefit the group to which they belong. And groups with altruistic members outcompete groups that don't have altruistic members. And that would include groups that have, let's say, self-sacrificial behaviors on the part of organisms within them. So our spectrum goes from the things I've been discussing: kin selection, reciprocal altruism, indirect, group selection, which is, as I say, more controversial, but it seems to be increasingly considered by people in the biological world, to the more theological, the more explicitly theological. Um, the biological understanding of altruism is entirely descriptive. It's just referring to an interaction where one loses something and one gains something. It prescinds from any consideration of motivation. But a theological meaning of altruism views it as a form of costly cooperation in which an individual is motivated by goodwill or love for another. Some might call this actually true altruism, maybe for the first time in our spectrum, where the loss to the actor and the gain to the recipient is not just the outward form or the inadvertent result, it's the intended purpose of the behavior. The good to others is the principal reason that it's undertaken, and the loss is purposely and consciously accepted and endorsed. This motivated altruism encompasses, as we would see, explicitly religious activity undertaken in the light of rewards that don't figure at all in purely biological estimation. Eternal life, communion with God, spiritual joy, holiness, love of neighbor. We are now in the realm of theological accounts. And even though naturalistic biological theory doesn't credit these as having any objective content in their terms, yet I think evolutionary accounts tend to confirm that these forms of motivated altruism are in fact associated with the human breakthrough into eusociality. Those two things historically went together. And so they've been crucial to human society itself. So finally, on this spectrum, we can note an ultimate dimension of explanation, God's practice of altruism towards creation. The gift of creation is one with no conceivable survival value to God. It's a pure donation, a pure gift to the existence of the other as the other. And from that perspective, the monotheistic perspective, we would look at this whole spectrum as a kind of unified field where the various ranges of altruism and forgiveness are, in a way, just a pyramid of empirical accounts that all descend from the ultimate form of donation and self-giving of God. Okay, that's a lot of background, maybe a little heavy going for people, but forgiveness, back to forgiveness. Forgiveness, then I'm saying, is a form of altruism, a peculiar form of altruism that's essential to cooperation. And there's recent research on the mathematical principles that guide evolution, particularly the work of Martin Nowak, that has connected altruism and forgiveness explicitly. And in fact, Nowak worked in collaboration with the theologian Sarah Coakley to spell this out in a book they wrote, Evolution, Games, and God. The general thrust of Nowak's research suggests, and Coakley underlines this too, that cooperation has been a much more dominant force in evolutionary history, not just for humans, but for all organisms, than has been given credit. It drives evolution no less than selective competition. And the altruism described in the more biological end of our spectrum, Nowak says, it just provides the essential wiring for that cooperation. That these forms of altruistic behavior are the lineaments, the tendons of cooperation. And cooperation is really the name of the game in the biological world, where some organisms become symbiotic, organisms even join together to become no longer separate organisms, but one organism. And so Nowak wants to underline that side of the evolutionary story. So cooperation is a balance of competition and symbiotic trust. And indirect or reputational altruism involves a wider trust in a network of relations in the spirit and distinguishing marks that bind the group together. And Nowak's point is that no group can survive if that trust is constantly and completely betrayed. But no group can survive if that trust is never healed through forgiveness after being broken. And I'm going to explain that a bit more. Nowak's special contribution comes at the intersection of game theory and evolutionary thought. He's focused on the prisoner's dilemma. Many of you have probably heard about this thought experiment and its relevance to the evolution of cooperation. The dilemma is a staple of game theory. You've got two criminals arrested for the same crime. They're interrogated separately. If they both insist on their innocence, then they each get the best result. They may get off entirely. If one turns and the other doesn't, the one who turns gets the better outcome. If they both confess or they both implicate the other person, then they each get the worst possible outcome. So it's a stylized picture of something that Nowak and evolutionary theorists think is central in the whole history of biological development, because the dilemma stems from the fact that the best course of action depends upon the anticipated choice of the other party. And the relevance for this, for evolutionary theory, arises when it's considered as a repeated process, not a one-off instance, but where the two agents involved are continually meeting this situation, and not with the same partner, but with just a succession of other agents in a pool of actors. And so you're always facing a choice: cooperate or defect, cooperate or defect. And the prisoner's dilemma is always in place. If you cooperate, you may get the maximum benefit with both of you cooperating. That's the best outcome for each of you. If you cooperate, you might get taken as a sucker and you get the worst outcome while someone else gets the better one. If you both defect, then neither of you were, deceived, but neither of you gets even the middling result. So Nowak was able to set this up in such a way that they could run computer simulations to see what's the best strategy. Best strategy meaning in terms of evolution, biological success. And when they first did this, they found that the most successful strategy was tit for tat. That seems to have a pretty ancient lineage: an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. If your immediately past interaction with someone, in that interaction they defected, then you should do that the next time that you interact with someone. If they cooperated, you'll cooperate the next time. So it's a kind of unforgiving strategy. But Nowak found something interesting, and that is when the game was adjusted to better reflect the real world, the best outcome changed. In the real world, it's not always possible to know perfectly whether someone has cooperated or not, or whether they intended to defect or not, or whether they repent of defecting. Limits to knowledge and errors in our perception are always present. So when you introduce noise into the system, when you introduce uncertainty, which is the truth of the situation, when you do that, the winning program changes. The winning program becomes what Nowak calls generous tit for tat. And what that means is that with that strategy, the player randomly, gratuitously, sometimes decides to respond to defection with cooperation. They forgive the fact that they were defected from the last time, and they decide not to hold it against, not that individual, but to hold it against, you might say, the system. They practice proactive forgiveness in a certain way. So Nowak shows that practicing that behavior is actually much more successful and beneficial for the self-interest of the organisms involved. So they discovered that the more realistic they were, the less this computer world, this evolutionary world, the less it settled into any stable equilibrium. It continually cycled through different conditions. And different conditions, different strategies were more successful. Sometimes selfish programs tended to dominate. Before, they were undermined by a kind of death spiral dynamic, where if everyone always defects, people get less and less and less and less by way of benefits, and the system tends to degrade. So as more generous programs gain success, even more generous ones outcompete them because you can expect there to be a lot of cooperative response and you can get better outcomes if you just always plan on having cooperation. And that goes on for a while until it becomes too rich a field for the selfish programs because there's so many suckers available that you can succeed. So there's a tension between a kind of race to the bottom and a race to the top. So I'm suggesting that this perspective offers us an interesting, a kind of stripped down paradigm for forgiveness. This isn't everything that forgiveness is, but it's an interesting dimension of it. The injury at issue here is the defection of a pardon, the failure to cooperate, for which, in a way, the purely just response would be to respond with the same thing: don't cooperate, defect. But the successful strategy is one that incorporates some kind of non-retaliation, that incorporates some proactive forgiveness, not even dependent on some demonstration of the other's repentance, for instance. So forgiveness, admittedly, in this system, forgiveness is a seasoning. It's not all consuming. It's a certain amount is beneficial, too much is not necessarily. But its complete absence is completely destructive. Its complete absence is a total non-starter. That's the interesting point. So you might say forgiveness as an effective strategy seems like a contradiction in terms. If you undertake it without intention, is it actually forgiveness? So clearly, forgiveness has to make sense at the individual level at which it's practiced in some way. But the key takeaway to me is that forgiveness has a systemic role where the health of individual organisms interlocks with the health of their communities. Groups that foster forgiveness amongst their members are healthier than those that don't. And I think this mirrors the spiritual dynamics of forgiveness. We can focus on the benefits that may flow to the individuals for giving up bitterness and freedom for new life and healing and so on. Or you can see the process as a part of an economy of abundance, in that forgiveness, like the more generous strategies in no-act simulations, improves the outcomes not just for the forgiver and the forgiven, but for everyone in the system, in the same community. In social terms, forgiveness is not a zero-sum game. So this gives us an interesting perspective on the default context for human forgiveness. And we see how other people can have an investment in the practice or non-practice of forgiveness between primary parties. You might not be the offended party, you might not be the offending party, but you have an interest in whether the parties find a certain kind of reconciliation. We think of, theologically, we think of intercession, where a third party intervenes on behalf of others. And we could say that in concrete terms, it can be the entire community that is the intercessor in this evolutionary sense. And of course, it works the other way. I could be less forgiving of someone's offense against me, or if others in my community are kind of pressuring me not to be forgiving, don't extend that kind of forgiveness to them. So our societies, in fact, incorporate many aspects of this excess we've been describing, this kind of proactive form of forgiveness. We build in structural reset features for those who have been defectors in their social engagements. We have bankruptcy for people who have defaulted on their financial obligations. We have different standards for first offenders as opposed to repeat offenders. We have judicial sanctions that are different for juveniles than for adults. And these systematic forms of forgiveness seek to serve the group as a whole, not only the individuals, to avoid negative feedback spirals and to maximize the collective good. I would say they embody a certain aspect of generous tit for tat. But those structural resets draw on a finite amount of social capital. The spontaneous trust and cooperative behavior that's circulating in a community based on the expectation that others will respond with the same trust and cooperation. If the capital falls below a certain level, then everyone begins to suffer dramatically. Just as at the individual level, we look for repentance to typically precede forgiveness, at the collective level, we look for a more diffuse but real benefit to come to the community in the wake of the systematic form of forgiveness. Now, many of you have probably been waiting or wondering, what about a pretty obvious question here? Everything I've been talking about doesn't really seem to fit with what many of our religious traditions say about forgiveness. Religions, and monotheism specifically, do not seem to be in the business of advocating just a probabilistic, strategic form of forgiveness that I've been describing to a large extent. They teach a universal and unrestrained version of forgiveness. Now, monotheisms do fit well with the pattern I've just described in one respect. Monotheism, forgiveness is a virtue that applies to people who have a future together. This appears empirically true in that the practice of forgiveness flourishes among those who believe they have a social future together. In light of our biological discussion, we could also say that without the practice of forgiveness, communities and their members don't have a social future together. That is actually kind of a dividing line. And monotheisms understand this future ultimately in eschatological terms. An interesting note from Nowak's studies is that the flux in his system, as I've described, sometimes verge toward an extremely high level of cooperation and forgiveness. You might say an almost kind of paradisical level. The meek in his computer models do only temporarily inherit the earth for a period of time, practicing an excess where reciprocity and proactive non-retaliation lead to a mutual abundance that benefits everyone in the system. Now, the eschatological vision, I think, is that impermanent tendency that's already there, built into the biological dynamic, can be deepened and stabilized. And that's the divine aim for humanity. The hope of forgiveness as a universal feature is really a stake marking that aim, that hope, that outer boundary. So the quick overview of the evolutionary perspective that I've provided raises the possibility from a naturalist point of view that this universal excess and forgiveness, like forgive 70 times 7 and so on, is only a veneer. It's just a facade. Religious people don't really believe it, and they don't really do it. It just is a kind of veneer for preferential treatment toward those in your own group, maybe your own religious group. And there certainly are strong tendencies to apply these principles first and foremost amongst the faithful, amongst the in-group. And some of the injunctions we now see routinely as universal might initially have referred mainly to the circle of co-believers. The Lord's Prayer frames its request to God to forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. It's a form consistent with indirect altruism. We do to others what we want them to do to us. We want God to forgive us, we forgive others. The practice of forgiveness toward others is a kind of intercession to God on our own behalf, that we should be forgiven. But this objection, the objection I just named, I think doesn't hold for a very empirical reason. The teaching of universal forgiveness, to say that it only serves selfishness of an existing in-group or existing religious in-group, ignores the fact that it's the selfishness of such a community level that has already been transcended in an extraordinary transformation in the transition of human beings into eusociality. It's a proof of concept because it's already happened. If it only was about the existing group, then we would not have the human groups that we have now. So the first great barrier to be breached in the expansion of human cooperation was the kin envelope. And in advancing a universal ethic, a universal diagnosis of the need and the application of forgiveness, monotheisms played a key role in widening the circle from family and clan to all. It didn't work out practically to be literally all, but it did work out to be effectively and empirically a much bigger all than it had been before. I mean, an extraordinarily larger all. So rather than being the proxy for selfishness for an existing group, forgiveness and the religious framework around it was the means by which the group itself changed. The group itself became larger and more inclusive. An evolutionary view suggests that it was the excess in the religious scope of forgiveness that helped shift the biological goalpost toward human eusociality that I discussed earlier. So religion itself was an enabling means in the transition to the eusociality of human culture. Those unrelated, unfamiliar ones who belonged to these new, wider human networks became cultural kin by adoption, by becoming part of this new religiously defined unity. Too large to be integrated by any individual memory or comprehension, the group was referred to one maker, one lawgiver, one whose perspective encompassed and judged all. And leaving vengeance for the Lord meant to practice forgiveness within this community. So monotheism's universal reference may regularly have been stepped down from that universal boundary in practical application to apply more strongly to those who were closer than those who were more distant. But it still represented a quantum expansion of the prior scale of both imagined and actualized human community. The vision of forgiveness without boundaries spread this dynamic into operation with groups wider than kin, even though the relevant universe remained a group among other groups. So to forgive someone you had never met before because of their commonality with you in this new scale of community was to forgive everyone or all with a new meaning, not, as I say, not totally universal, but an expanded one. So monotheisms understood themselves to be universal in a manner commensurate with the scope of the God that they worshiped. And whether they were explicitly conversionist as Christians and Muslims, or less so as with rabbinic Judaism, the current boundaries of intergroup competition were never fixed. The members of other groups were the objects of God's concern and potential members of the home group, if not now eschatologically. So I'm coming close to the end now for your forbearance. I appreciate. So NOAC's models that I described reflect a tension that we know well from experience. The tension between the impetus toward altruistic generosity that can drive the group to higher levels of non-zero sum cooperation, the positive spiral, and the constraints required to police the rise of defector strategies that will take advantage of proactive altruism. So only the drive toward that universal horizon can do the former. That is, they drive greater and greater levels of non-zero sum cooperation. But only some kind of policing, only some kind of defense against free riders can maintain the community from too much defection. So the religious ideal is continually constrained by that. The eusocial breakthrough created a cultural setting where there are benefits to be found for human groups that explore higher and higher levels of generosity, even as they are straining against the dangers of defection. So the internal dynamic of these universal aspirations was to become more and more truly universal. This is evident in elements within each tradition that offer an explicit internal critique against the idea of restricting the forgiveness to the in-group. So the parable of the Good Samaritan, or the specific exhortation to forgive your enemies, those who are explicitly, right, the defectors, the dangers to your group, that underlines this in the strongest possible way. Those are the ones that pose a threat to the in-group, but even they should be forgiven. So ideals of forgiveness with such radical scope look toward a reconciliation in which competing groups unite eventually. It's a constant of eschatological expectation that all of humanity will at some point become one community. And just as monotheism's universal horizon pulled humans from a narrow kin and clan circle into truly eusocial communities, this dramatically expanded the functional boundary of the all that defined humanity. So the competition that was involved never was simply limited to that between human groups. It included human struggles to find sustainable livelihood in relation to the non-human world, microbes, vegetation, animals that surrounded them. So we could say the cooperation and the forgiveness integral to it raises the fitness of human beings, not just to flourish over against other groups, but to flourish as the entire community of human beings alongside the other organisms in the world. So, as monotheistic religion played a key role in humanity's first eusocial breakthrough, so I think the excess dimension in its approach to forgiveness may yet figure in another breakthrough of equal moment. This breakthrough would correspond to monotheism's explicit theoretical expectation for the relevant group to become humanity as a whole. And I'll end with a quote from David Sloan Wilson, who's an evolutionary biologist, and his recognition that religion was integral to the earlier eusocial transition. So he's very clear about that. This is the way it happened when we became human. And he suggests that his own secular evolutionary perspective, in fact, converges with the religious one in one profound conclusion. This is the assertion, he says, that the concept of organism has a movable boundary, which must be expanded to solve the problems of our age. The boundary that shifted to make human groups effectively into complex organisms, rising and falling in part on the strength of their interrelations, can move again to bring all of humanity and its necessary biosphere within that boundary. Well, I'd say it's a stimulating and ennobling idea to think that forgiveness, as part of our religious commitments, is a key part not only of this epoch-making part of our past, but functions in a similar way as we look toward the future. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mark. A brilliant, brilliant presentation. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to open it up for anyone in the audience here to unmute yourself and, raise your hand or just ask your question so that we can have some dialogue here for about 10 minutes. Okay, Michelle, go ahead.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for your talk, and just curious, I know this is a lot of research and science and theology you've presented today, but curious if you have a personal connection to this and what's been your own personal journey with forgiveness.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yes, I think I can't say that some people have a dramatic story about interpersonal individual level forgiveness. I don't. I mean, not to that extent, but I do. I think I was captivated partly by this whole topic because I feel as though I've been the subject of proactive forgiveness in many ways in sort of my networks of so it's partly you look back and see you appreciate the way in which you receive things you didn't actually deserve, and it wasn't the decision of necessarily of a single person. It was the fact that maybe it was your family, maybe it was a particularly warm community. It was set up in a way that it extended to you the grace that you kind of took for granted until you saw that that isn't the way the world necessarily works, right, more widely.
Thank you.
Okay, Camelia, go ahead.
Thank you so much for this very interesting talk. The way I'm thinking about it, it's very complex, very theoretical in many respects, but with direct implications, practical implications. And I would like to ask a question more about the practical implications and the day-to-day consideration of forgiveness. In my own personal experience as a psychiatrist, as a clinician, I find forgiveness to there are kinds of forgiveness. There's kind of good forgiveness and maybe sometimes not so good. And I think it comes in close connection with the learning that comes from that process. And maybe the connection with forgetting. Do you forgive and forget completely all the evil or all the betrayal, and you behave like it never happened again, going with an open chest? Do you forgive and learn from it and change some things? And I have to go as far as to say that I see cases where forgiveness might mean enabling or creating some entitled members of communities or families. I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit about this very complicated process.
Yes, I think what you say is absolutely correct. The conference at Harvard back in April, there was quite animated discussion about this. So several presenters were, cautioning about the dangers of forgiveness. And I think that's true at the individual level. That is to say, clearly there's ways in which it can be not healthy to too readily forgive what hasn't been actually addressed or processed. And in a way, I'm looking at it in a kind of similar way at the larger picture, because there's a dark side to the communal idea of forgiveness, because it can be enforced right on people. It's the pressure of belonging to a group that you could feel that I'm required to forgive in a certain way, or I must act as though I forgive because my community requires it of me. But it might not be the best thing for my own integrity and my own development. So it's complex for sure, and I think the interface that's developing with a kind of public health perspective on forgiveness, I think I'm not sure that it's taken on board all these complexities, and I'm not quite sure how to do that adequately. It almost becomes a kind of social psychiatry, right? A kind of analysis of the community and how do we give people the right incentives and the right support. So I don't really have any great wisdom on that, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Salima, you're up next. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I wasn't able to come off video. Thank you again, Mark, for your talk. Really enjoyed it, especially the communal aspect of not forgiving and what happens within the systems, and how we can at some point really become one community and end some of the awful wars that we're seeing going on in the world right now. My question really has to do with has any research been done on the effect of members of a community not willing to forgive each other that live together in a spiritual community?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I was starting to say not to my knowledge. I'm just wondering. There's been a lot of research on kind of the role of religious commitment, religious affiliation in community, in forming communities and maintaining communities, and so on. And so I'm thinking that there's probably data there in some of these studies that hasn't been looked at from the perspective you're suggesting. That is to say, the studies have been, to what extent does religious commitment enhance community formation?
Right.
They probably have data in the studies where cases where it wasn't doing that because there was conflict right amongst the people. Because sometimes you can have conflict that's occasioned by your religious commitment, perhaps, right? You disagree about revelation, you disagree about different things, and so I'm thinking maybe it's a little bit like these kind of medical research where people go back and reanalyze the studies and say, oh, we're asking a question they weren't asking. It would be an interesting one to do.
And where would you suggest I might go to
Well,
have
I'm
that?
thinking there's a scholar Richard Sosis, I think is Sosis. I'm not quite sure how he pronounces that. But he's written a lot about communities and religious commitments. And I think if you looked at some of his works, he would have a lot of bibliography about other people who've done the same sort of studies. And like I say, most of the studies are demonstrating or showing the benefit of religious, for instance, intentional communities, people who go off, to form communities, whether they're ashrams or go back to the land or in the 1960s or today. And his studies showed that those that had a religious foundation, they were longer lived. They survived longer and they, flourished more. That was kind of the point of the studies. But I suspect if you looked in there and saw the ones that didn't, and including some of the religious ones that didn't, you would see maybe some data relevant to your question.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Molly, I believe that you're up.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this talk. I wanted to ask about self-forgiveness. I work with clients who are grieving, and I find that self-forgiveness seems very inaccessible to many people, especially those who think that they have to go to their religious or spiritual group for that forgiveness, or to their clergy person. And I wonder if you have any comments on that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's as I say, the kind of research that I alluded to but didn't talk about, the individual focus, there is a lot about this. I think Everett Worthington and I'm trying to think the other person, first name I'm blocking on, Enright. These are like the two most prominent scholars, and self-forgiveness is definitely a distinct category, and it's addressed in the research and so on. Your point is an interesting one that I hadn't thought too much about, which is to say, what's the religious element and the non-religious element in the self-forgiveness. And for people who are deeply committed or involved in a community, it may be hard to access the self-forgiveness without some connection to authority or a community. And I think that relates to the community discussion that I've been focusing on today, is because you kind of, how much authorization or how can you valorize your own sense that, oh, I am forgiven, I have to forgive myself. Is that acceptable? It kind of has to get some wider validation in that process. But I don't have much more to say about that.
Thank you.
Dorothy, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Mark, that was an excellent presentation. Thank you. It really has brought up a lot for me. Having practiced in rural communities most of my life, and especially in island communities, in here and in Greece, the whole concept of forgiveness and how do you start the conversations? When I was young, we built communities, even in the cities. If we had block parties, we cut off our block, we watched over each other. And then that sort of disappeared. And what would happen if we took a look at rural communities and looked at some of the ways that people started to build communities? And I guess I don't know what I'm talking about right now, but I'm thinking of a future research project, and back to building communities and hearing each other's stories.
Yeah, it's an interesting point to think about. The infrastructure of community is really our training for forgiveness. It's really if we wouldn't see it or know it or feel like we could do it if we hadn't observed it in some way around us. And the less thick our experience of community is, I think the less we have models for that. As I say, in my response to an earlier question, it was only I look back at my own life and I see the way in which I was the beneficiary of this, and that kind of enabled me to have a certain attitude toward it. But nothing was explicit in that whole process. It was really had to do with the nature of communities and our lack of communities that has a sad follow-on effect in probably our capacity to conceive of forgiveness in a proactive way.
Good.
That's very, very interesting. I remember also years ago doing my research for a social work degree, and I built it on existential therapy and existential theory, and then interviewed people in the community who were caregivers, and that balance that people seem to believe in, being here in the world in all three spheres, the physical, the social, and the spiritual. And I think this is what you're talking about. Thank you.
Okay, Bevan, you are the last person to ask a question, and then we will have to end our seminar.
Well, what is it? They say the last shall be first or something. My work in hospice has taught me a lot about forgiveness, self-forgiveness and forgiveness within families. And I think a lot of it, I never really put this term boundaries that Mark just said, has a lot to do with it. Can you extend your boundary to your beliefs or your hurt or your pain to embrace someone else's mistreatment of you or lack of love of you or criticism of you, that type of thing. That the boundaries I have seen to be very extreme on one end, in some faith communities where they just that person now becomes a sinner. That person is not going to heaven. And of course at end of life, that is a common discussion. Is that person going to have an afterlife? Is God going to accept them into the heavenly realms or whatever? Or you have on the other extreme, you have a very inclusive community that sometimes comes in and adopts that person. And I would say hospice, many ways becomes the family when unforgiveness, the hospice staff becomes the loving family that embraces that person that the family cannot. And many times I found that I was now using that term of boundary, was bringing the boundaries closer together of a family, bringing members of family that were estranged for 25 years. And all of a sudden, this is the last moment that they have, and helping to facilitate that conversation. And how frequently I found out they actually didn't remember what caused the anger or the separation or whatever. And that when communication happens, real communication, and they can have someone who can listen, or they can witness someone who forgives that person. And I remember saying to someone, so what? So what? That's between them and their God. And let's think about judgment. And let's think about the life that you're talking about that is about to pass before you, and the opportunity that you have. And people used to ask me, how can you do hospice? And I used to say, oh, you don't see the love that I see. You don't see the transformation that I see. and the power of God's movement that I see every day. When people are allowed to be in community and remember that they're family, and to express, the pain and be heard, and then know that they were forgiven, and the peace that fills the room is an amazing, amazing eternal peace.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, it's interesting that when the question is God's attitude toward us, right? We're all maximalists about God's forgiving scope. We all want it to go to the furthest extreme possible, and that's good for us to turn around and think, well, then it's our extension of that boundary right around us that's the truest reflection of God's attitude, of God's aim, and that you live in the midst of seeing that, maybe the boundary has been drawn really, really narrow, just around a few people in the family as opposed to other people. And now
Mhm.
just to get it to include that little circle, what an incredible transformation that means. So I think that's also gives us a taste of what hopefully that is on an even larger scale. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, that was beautiful. Mark, thank you for a great presentation. And even though haven't been feeling well because you've had COVID or have COVID right now, so thank you so much for doing this. And all of us have benefited a lot from this. So, and thank you all also for your questions. And otherwise, we'll see you next month. Take care.